famous painting, Watson and the Shark.
Ma'am,
Would you
give
like
give
to?
us 1 second. The recording is still processing. So as soon as it starts, I'll let you know. Give me
Okay,
one
okay.
second. Yeah.
So,
Yes, ma'am, it has started recording.
okay. Keep in mind everything that we have discussed so far, the ways in which romanticism sees man, nature, the turbulent sea. Would you like to tell me what do you think of this painting? This is Copland's painting Watson and the Shark. Would you like to try? What do you see
Um,
here?
man, is that man swimming there, or he dropped from the boat,
No, he's about to be drowned, and his friends are trying to save him.
from the sharks?
Yes, from the shark. You see the shark, no? It's there.
Yes, right.
Do we have a story here? Do we have a moment here?
It feels like a moment whether he could
Yes.
die or he will be saved
Yes.
by his friends.
Is this a biblical figure or is this a common human man here?
Common human man looks like.
Good. This is a common human man here. Is this something that is about life and ways by which you can easily die,
Yes,
something like that, or is it like a grand heroic
no, no,
story that
it looks like it really shows that human life is so fragile or so frail that
yes,
we could die any moment by
yes,
the hand of nature.
yes, yes. 1778, in fact, Copland, and he is drawing this. This is based on a story of a 14-year-old boy who has just dropped into the ocean, and his friends were frantically trying to save him. And one of the things that Copley does
Ma'am,
is that
the picture reminds me of Moby Dick.
yes. But 1778 Copley here is not talking about Moby Dick. In fact, he is talking about how a
80 years
human,
later.
yes, he is talking about a human being who is fragile, who is frail, as opposed to see the large part of the painting is the sea, and the water are not comforting, nice blue water. These are all a stormy, turbulent
Ma'am,
sea
it's
that you have.
green water, right?
Yes. So it's
That
a
means it's
turbulent
cold.
sea that you have. Yes.
It's
And
cold.
also nature, that is shark, that is a violent figure. That is something that the human figures are trying to subdue and save, but in all probability we don't know. This is a moment of crisis. Now this painting is not depicting any moral subject, not depicting a traditional, religious, mythical, allegorical subject. This painting is about a very common occurrence in any fishing community. It's a real event that men can fall into the sea and be attacked by a shark. 1778, when it was first exhibited in Royal Academy, the title of the painting was "A Boy Attacked by a Shark, Rescued by Some Seamen in a Boat," founded on a fact which happened in the harbor of Havana. So, like I told you, this is something that had happened, and the audience is completely drawn towards the greasy. So, see, the shark is just about to perhaps eat and tear the flesh of the man's hand. It's just there. So, the dramatic moment is there. The Copley is here telling masterfully a specific moment where the common men are trying to save heroically the life of another man. And 1778, there is a newspaper review of this painting that says that the rescuers are noble men because they went and saved another man. There is a historian also who is describing this painting. Just let me read this. For this writer, the story is one of heroic action. Remember, romantic art, poetry, or visually is always about action. The moment is always about action. In the face of terror, this is not a comforting experience, this is a terrifying experience. of compassion for the sufferer in the face of insatiable greed and cosmic indifference. The nature here, the sky, the horizon, the sea, it's turbulent, it's indifferent to the fate of man. It is the story of a few common men who worked together and nobly exerted themselves. Now, this idea of a real experiences of real men written in a language of ordinary language of common man. This is one of the beautiful ways by which Wordsworth writes what is romanticism and the language of romanticism in his preface. We'll do this. So this is literally history as it is depicted for men. The painting here is trying to reenact a battle between the shark, the water, the sea, and few men who are not exceptional. These are not hero figures. These are few men who are trying to save another man from a horrifying, terrifying spectacle of his limbs being teared apart by a shark. Now, what you see here, and are there specific moment. In fact, there's a very beautiful phrase that Wordsworth says. Wordsworth's poetry is always about, poems are also about moments, specific moments. He uses this phrase, spots of time. What we see are fragments of a drama. These are not linear, larger narratives that romanticism shows us, be it a visual drama, be it visual art, or be it poetry, or be it novels. We are not about larger narratives. These are all spots of time. These are all moments, fragments of a drama, moments in a single action which has retired from direct expression and can only reach us through imagination. They can only appear in front of the audience through a vocabulary of imaginary. And what kind of vocabulary is that? So when I use the word vocabulary, I'm including both the poetic diction as well as the visual art here. Now, therefore, in romantic art, we will always have dreams coming in. We'll have hills that are swirling. There is no tranquility. We will have nature becoming emblematic, and this is important, nature becoming emblematic of the mind. So when Wordsworth is describing Tinton Abbey, he is not describing what he sees when he goes to Tinton Abbey. The first sentence of Tinton Abbey is lines written in Tinton Abbey that he encountered 5 years before. Now, at present, he's sitting in his apartment in London. He's recollecting his experience of past. His mind is now interpreting in terms of abstract imaginary what happened before. And this takes me to Wordsworthian idea. The romantic notion that man, his faculty of imagination, is the subject and object of poetry. His misery is juxtaposed to the overwhelming nature. And this beautifully comes in, in a lot of work that we see of Wordsworth. So Wordsworth, in fact, gives us a definition, that poetry is always spontaneous overflow of feelings that are recollected in tranquility. The key word is recollected. It is not something that you experience out there and begin to represent. He's not talking about representation. He's talking about recollection. He's talking about when your mind is completely overwhelmed by an overflow of feelings. And he says that this cannot be done in the gaudiness and inane phraseology of the Augustan age. We cannot write in meter because your mind is so overwhelmed with the external reality. Therefore, your mind is excited. And in that moment of excitement, you can only compose poetry in the common language of man. You can
Ma'am,
only write in the language of the low and the rustic. Yes, please ask me.
um, probably that Wordsworth said that spontaneity. When we write poetry, the spontaneity is the key element he told about, right?
Yes, yes,
Uh, um, in Augustine, there was so many diction, so many
yes.
formal language and um, what do you
Order.
say, procedure, etc. So, is that which interrupts the spontaneity, right?
Yes. In fact, Wordsworth says exactly this, that meter is superficial and an artificial addendum to language. It is something that interrupts the natural flow of language. He's saying that poet meter is something that is not at all essential. It is only something that is artificial and superficially added. And at the same time, he's not saying that poetry is a representation of nature. Poetry, poem, or any aesthetic experience is always how your individual consciousness is affected by the external reality. Is this distinction clear?
Yes, ma'am.
This is in your head, you must draw it, I say. So when Wordsworth is saying that, he's looking into the world, he says that my senses are affected. He says that he's rejecting the poetic diction, as you rightly pointed out, the poetic diction. He's privileging the ordinary language of men in order to describe and express what he feels nature is, how imagination, his sensory perception. Remember that flow chart that we discussed. So you have the sense, then you have the sensory perceptions, then you have the discerning power of the mind. The discerning power of the mind makes those reflections. After reflection, you have ideas. Those ideas eventually become the poetic consciousness and create a poem. This is a circle that we have. Did you understand? This is just a diagram that I'm trying to explain you. So you
Yes, ma'am.
have, you want me to repeat anything that you're not?
Yeah, please come again. That part, this part, I mean.
So you have Wordsworth here who is saying that, I'll give you the example of the tree. This is something that I use always in the classroom, that Wordsworth says that there's a tree out there, or think about the lake. He's talking about, he writes this beautiful poem, the boat stealing episode. It appears in Prelude. He was a 10-year-old boy when he stole a boat and he was rowing the boat towards the mountain in the lake. What happens is he's a 10-year-old boy. So as he's rowing towards the mountain grows. For Wordsworth, that is terrifying. He's scared. He feels that suddenly the mountain is terrifying and it is magnificent. But that magnificent is so overwhelming for him that he rushes back home, and for almost 10 days he cannot speak to anyone, he cannot go out of the room. He's completely overpowered by those huge, majestic mountains. Later on, now he's not writing as a 10-year-old boy. He's writing as an adult Wordsworth, sitting in London, recollecting his experience of what had happened when he was a 10-year-old boy. He recollects that experience of encountering nature. That is a specific moment that he is describing, spot of time. That nature affects him, his senses overpowers him, his imagination is completely overpowered, and he imagines that the mountains are growing, the mountains are overwhelming, the mountains are awe-inspiring, terrifying right in front of him. That imagination, that faculty of imagination, is what is poetic consciousness for Wordsworth and allows him to write the poem called Prelude. In Prelude, we encounter the adult Wordsworth talking about his 10-year-old boy, his experience of encountering the mountains. Did you understand?
Yes, ma'am.
Okay. Now, quickly, lyrical ballads is the preface to lyrical ballads is very often considered to be the most important text when it comes to, and it is an essay. So it is considered to be almost a critical manifesto that describes and attempts to formulate the ways by which you can make sense of romanticism philosophically. Now, Wordsworth here is also not writing as a poet, but he's also writing as a critic here. Now, these are the key ideas of romanticism that Wordsworth proposes. He's saying that the principal object then proposed in these poems was to choose incidents and situations from common life and to relate or describe them throughout as far as possible in a selection of language, please underline for yourself, really used by men. So we are talking about incidents, situations which are of common people, language that is used by common folk, and you would have the faculty of imagination where ordinary things like an ordinary experience of a 10-year-old boy stealing a boat rowing towards a mountain presented to the mind in an unusual aspect, something that we call the sublime. Did you understand this?
Yes,
Do
ma'am.
you want me to repeat?
Yes, ma'am.
Okay.
No, no, no,
Now,
no.
yes,
It's all right, I said.
I can repeat if it is not
No,
okay.
no, no, but it's okay. I just
Okay.
overlapped my.
Okay. So what we have then is slowly, as Wordsworth, as a critic, is trying to explain us what is a good poem. If you see this definition carefully, he is giving us a definition of who is a romantic poet and what is romantic poetry. And something that we discussed before, definition of romantic poetry overlaps with the definition of romanticism as a philosophical tradition and definition of who is a romantic poet or a romantic artist. So quickly we'll do a revision of what these ideas are. A poem is, you cannot be talking to each other. You are not talking to an aristocrat. You're talking to all men. This is also true. Just now we did that romantic art. You're talking to common men. You are speaking as a man to all men. A poet is someone who has the greater knowledge of human nature, a greater power of communication, and can communicate not just his own experiences, his own individual experiences, but also can express what he perceives in his environment. It is therefore philosophical because the object of poetry, is truth. Truth meaning as and how the poet perceives the world, perceives the external reality. He will go beyond the artificial verbal artifices of language, beyond the mere ornamentation of meter and order and the forms of writing of the neoclassical age. And he will only, his purpose of writing would be only to present the truth. And therefore, repeatedly, Wordsworth gives his definition spontaneous overflow of powerful emotions recollected in tranquility. Now, from a mimetic definition, mimetic meaning you see the world, you try to represent it as and how it is. This is the Platonic idea. So, mimetic, mimesis, reflection, you reflect what you
Imitation,
see.
isn't it? Imitation.
Imitation, yes. So your mimesis from a mimetic definition of poetry, art. Romanticism, we arrive at an expressive definition. How you are not talking about the tree, you're not talking about the lake, you're not talking about the turbulent sea, but how our ordinary life, in a language of ordinary language, how you are affected by those external reality. The concept of how your mind perceives, remember, we are talking about a mind that is perceiving in solitary, unmediated contemplation of nature against what you consider as reason and intellect. So we are not talking about reason, we are not talking of intellect, we are talking about imagination. That is a faculty that works in tranquility, in solitude, in unmediated contemplation. It is ideally an unchanged individual consciousness and something that goes against the institutionalized dictates of the society. And we did just now as to why romantics were so against of everything that was institutionalized dictates. So therefore there was a revolutionary ideal. They wanted to move away from everything that the society believed. This is the sequence, this is the order, this is the meter you are going to follow, this is how we write, this is how we think, this is how you draw. Every romantic, be it a novelist, be it a visual artist, be it a poet, everyone in their own way tried to move beyond what they thought as the institutions of power and authority. A poet in that case is a man speaking to men, and he will communicate not just his feelings but also what he sees in his environment. And poetry will always be in the language of the low and the rustic, is the breadth and finest spirit of all knowledge, and is emblematic of a deep sympathy between man and nature about common life and ordinary things. Now, what are the key ideas in preface? The key ideas in preface are: A, it will be not written in a language of poetic diction, what you have been taught to identify as poetic diction. That is not necessarily essential to poetry. It might be there, it might not be there, but that is not what makes poetry poetic. Meter, rhyme, arrangement of words is not what poetry is about. Those are gaudy, glossy, and superficial. What it does is it alienates human from their language. It alienates, dissociates human from human, the vocabulary by which he's expressing. So, what is then poetry? Wordsworth will tell us. Poetry, there is no difference between prose and poetry. Whether you are writing in meter or whether you are not writing in meter, it is not a defining feature of poetry. Poetry is not essential. What is important is, as a poet, you are speaking as a man and you are speaking to other men in a language of men, in order to express your essential feelings, the real feelings of a real man about the world, in order to affect and effect this world. Now, Wordsworth preface then conveniently goes against the conventional ideas of what are the ways by which we understand poetry. And we have to place this newer ideas of poetic diction in the context of French Revolution, which is completely doing away with the ways in which you understand human life, against monarchy, against anything that is dictating how you understand freedom. Ideally, then we are talking about this subjective emotion, and this subjective emotion is what is crucial to the poetic consciousness. This poetic consciousness and the subjective emotion then are all ways by which, be it Wordsworth as a poet or radicals as William Godwin, all of them are going against what I'm repeating, the institutional dictate of the society. Now, Coleridge Coleridge is important because Coleridge and Wordsworth, in fact, were friends and they had written together the book, The Lyrical Ballads. Eventually, he publishes a response to the Lyrical Ballads, the preface to Lyrical Ballads of Biographia Literaria, to examine, to a large extent, Coleridge says that, that what Wordsworth is saying, that is true. Theoretically, meter cannot be a ways by which you understand poetry. But at the same time, if that were true, then there should be, everyone should be a poet. What you write and what I write, everyone should be a poet, because everyone has the faculty to have sensory perception. You go and see a tree, you are having sensory perception, you are affected by the tree, you make those discerning power of the mind. Eventually your consciousness is affected, and then you have the faculty of imagination. Every common man then should be a poet, isn't it true? So Coleridge is saying that why does it happen? Why is it that only say you are a poet and I am not a poet? Why does it happen that not everyone is a poet? Now, Coleridge then extends the argument of preface and writes this beautiful book, Biographia Literaria. He critiques the prefaces and he says that, everyone does not have the faculty of imagination as same. And that is where Coleridge's two idea of imagination become very important. Any idea what are these two kinds of imagination? Are you aware of it?
Imagination and fancy, or the
Fancy, yes.
primary or secondary imagination.
Good. Yes. So that is where Coleridge is extending Wordsworth's argument. And he's saying that, all of us have the faculty of imagination. In that case, all of us should be a poet. All of us can speak the language of the low and the rustic. And then he's critiquing the ways by which Wordsworth is defining poetry. In fact, from mimetic, Wordsworth takes us to an expressive definition of poetry. Coleridge extends it. Coleridge takes us from an expressive definition of poetry to a cognitive definition of poetry. And this is important. He's saying that, our sensory perceptions work differently. You see the world. I'll go back to my example of the tree. You and I, both of us, you go and see the green color. We make those, we see the sense. So first we have the sensory perception, then we reflect on it. Our discerning power of the mind associates it with our previous encounter. This is what he calls fancy. So based on your earlier encounter, your memory, you say that, oh, that green color, that is the color, that is a tree, that is not the grass. So that and you can make those judgments because you have what is called the faculty of memory. The term he is using is fancy. But fancy is common for everyone. So only memory does not lead us to poetry. So after memory, we have what is called the primary imagination. So primary imagination is when the mind uses those details from memory. It's called the definites and the fixities, processes it, and creates something new. This is the faculty of imagination. Again, Coleridge will say that, primary imagination is something that is common for all, you, me, everyone. But you, me, everyone are not poets. So what is it specifically in poets that is there? Coleridge gives us the term secondary imagination. He's saying it is the secondary imagination that is something the poet has recourse to, that is not different from primary imagination in terms of faculty, but only in terms of degree. So it is only different in terms of degree. So how you make and create new from disparate two different things, you put them together and create something new. That is what poetry is. And that is where Coleridge is differing from Wordsworth. Coleridge is saying that, no, it is not that you are describing and expressing the world as it is affecting you as a poet, and you are translating that experience to the audience. Instead, poets are creating what does not exist. For example, you can see a snow, but the poem on a snow or an essay on a snow did not exist prior to you writing it. Are you following? So, secondary imagination is a faculty by which Coleridge says that you are creating something that did not exist. But you cannot create it unless you have the faculty of fancy, the faculty of primary imagination. You can only arrive at secondary imagination through the route of sensory perception, discerning power of the mind, fancy, primary imagination, secondary imagination. Are you following the flow chart in your head?
Yes, ma'am. Ma'am,
Okay.
Coleridge also said the secondary imagination is the echo of the primary imagination.
Yes, it is. It is not an ego, but it is something that is heightened, something that it takes it a little better, difference in degree, not in kind. This is what he says.
And he told that fancy is passive and mechanic. I don't
Yes,
understand
we'll do
how
that.
it's mechanic, but
It is mechanic because, for example, you see, we'll do this, but he says that fixities and definites are mechanical, whereas imagination is organic. What is mechanical about it is that, for example, you've seen a cat, a tree. So your memory always has an image of a cat and a tree. And the moment you see an animal and you are making those discerning distinctions that is a cat as opposed to say a tiger or as opposed to a tree, those little distinctions that your faculty of mind is making is based on the definite image of definition of say a cat that is in your head. So the mind is processing based on the little nuggets, the little units of fixed identities that you have in your mind.
that means we
Therefore,
have
it
the
is
picture, but
mechanical.
every object has its own identity, right?
It has, but when you're thinking, looking at a cat, you're not thinking about the cat's identity. You're thinking
Okay.
the first, so you're making those first recognition that that animal that I'm seeing that is a cat as opposed to a human. How do you make that distinction that that is a cat and that is not a human and that is a tree? He's saying that you do it based on the discerning faculty of mind, and you're using now the faculty of fancy, where you're basing it on your earlier habits of association. We did this David Hartley's argument, habits of association,
Yes, yes, yes,
where
yes.
you're associating it with your previous memory. So you have to, for example, if I say there is an animal which has 5 legs, and I describe to you, but you have never seen an animal with a 5 legs, so
No.
you won't be able to picture it. And that is the reason eventually Coleridge's idea become indispensable to what we later have as structuralism, that
Okay.
words determine vocabulary, determine
Signified,
the ways
signified.
in which you perceive the world. So it is not that thoughts come before language. In fact, it is language that enables you to move to thought. One beautiful example is again Frankenstein's monster. He's able to have human emotions only after he sees and he reads and he's able to make sense of, Milton's book and other books
Hmm.
that he sees through the keyhole. So it is language that allows him an access to human emotions. And Coleridge is writing in 1817. This is the first time we have a cognitive definition of poetry, language. In fact, Coleridge is not talking only about poetry, he's talking about language in a larger detail. He's saying that, how your mind works, you process the details. It's not just you simply go and sense the sensory perceptions. You are not only an object of sense impressions, but you process those details. You reflect based on your earlier associated memory. And thereafter, you can create impressions. Therefore, eventually, what is poetry when the moment Coleridge is giving us takes us to what is art in Romanticism. Now, Coleridge's work then is not just a mechanistic definition, it is in fact a very autobiographical, philosophical, critical text that is giving us a very uh, new, unprecedented definition of what is imagination. It is somehow it is coming from a nexus of philosophy, religion, theory, and the practice of writing. And this is the definition that he is giving. I would like to read this. A poem is that species of composition which is opposed to works of science by proposing for his immediate object pleasure, not truth. This is where he's moving away from Wordsworth. Wordsworth repeatedly says the object of poetry is truth. But Coleridge says, but we cannot negate the fact that poetry provides us pleasure. And that is where poet is different from a man of science. A man of science is giving the example of mathematics, chemistry. You will have Biographia Literaria, chapter 4 and chapter 13 and chapter 14, where these examples are there. He's saying that it is not something that you read an entire poem and you arrive. Sometimes there are also little phrases that give you gratification. So, and for example, it's not that an entire book that you read and you can like the entire book, but there are also, aren't there certain sentences that stay with you? So, be it a poem or sometimes a novel, hasn't it ever happened with you?
Yes, obviously. Yeah, it happens to
Yes.
everyone almost.
Yes, so that is exactly what Coleridge is saying. That it is not just always that the whole that is giving you pleasure. It is also each component that is providing us. And it is not a single stanza on its own that will arrive at perfection. But single stanza, and he is giving this argument about part and a whole, where the single words, when they are arranged in a sequence, they provide us pleasure. Coleridge returns us back to rhyme and meter, and he's saying that we don't have to be so much against of rhyme and meter. It is also true that sometimes because the words are arranged in a specific manner, in a specific rhyme, that it is giving us pleasure. No, that sometimes the words are arranged in a way, the stanzas are arranged in a way that it is so beautiful to read at. And Coleridge is saying that let us not take that away from poetry. Let us not take that away from any kind of aesthetic experience. It is true that the whole component may be gratifying, the parts may be gratifying, but at the same time we also need to understand the fact, recognize the fact that even arrangement of individual parts in a specific order gives us pleasure. Is this idea clear? Because this is where he's moving away from Wordsworth. Now,
Coleridge almost described it as a clockwork, right?
hmm?
Almost described poetry as a clockwork.
Yes, because do you remember Kubla Khan?
Yes.
So Kubla Khan, in fact, is a fragment. Kubla
Yeah.
Khan, he wakes up out of his reverie. He goes to meet someone, and then he cannot write the poem any further. And what we
He
have as a
forgot it.
Kubla Khan is only a fragment. Now, that is a good example of how he considers poetry and poetic diction and the role of a poet and the aesthetic experience. That even a fragment can be a microcosm of all the emotions. Even a fragment can be, in its ideal perfection, provide us a gratifying experience. But at the same time, even an arrangement of those fragments in a specific order lead us to a gratifying pleasure and experience. And this is the definition, and I'm reading from Biographia Literaria. Let us go into this definition. Let's see if we can make sense of it, where Coleridge is defining a poet. The poet, described in ideal perfection, brings the whole soul of man into activity with the subordination of his faculties to each other, according to their relative worth and dignity. And he's saying that, the whole soul of man, it's not that suddenly, only one part of your mind is working and the other part of the minds are not working. All the faculties are working together. So fancy, primary imagination, secondary imagination, all are working in a harmonious whole in order to produce poem. He diffuses a tone and spirit of unity that blend and, as it were, fuses each into each by that synthetic and magical power, to which we have exclusively appropriated the name of imagination. This is exactly what we discussed. Imagination is what enables synthesis. Synthesis is meaning two disparates bringing together to create something that did not exist before. So A and B, put it together and you have maybe Z. So something that did not exist before, but you put them together, and this faculty that is synthesis that enables, creating by fusing disparates. This is what is called imagination. And this power first put in action by the understanding. First, you see the world, you make sense of the world, you perceive the world, you understand, you reflect, and after that you go into imagination. And retained under their irreversive and though gentle, unnoticed control, reveals itself in reconciliation of opposite and discordant qualities. So when you reconcile the opposites, or when you reconcile things that don't seem to be coordinating with each other, sameness, difference in general, so the general with the concrete, one idea with the other, one specific example with a larger narrative, the idea with the individual with the representative, the sense of novelty and freshness with old and familiar object, a more than usual state of emotion, more than usual order. I mean, all of us have witnessed sunset or sunrise at any point of time in our lives. But Coleridge would say, if you and I begin to describe a sunset, it is inevitable that your description and my description will be different. Not because you understand sunset and I understand sunset differently. Not because the sun is different to you and me. Not because you and I are sitting in different spots. Maybe you and I are sitting in the same external situation, the same external reality that is available to us. But the ways by which you will reconcile that experience of seeing the orange color sky, the ways in which your mind will make sense of that experience, that will be different from mine experience. And that is what is the faculty of imagination. And that is not mechanical, that is organic, that is an power that is alive, and that is magical, and that is synthetic. Synthetic meaning creates new from disparate objects. Synthesis. Is this clear?
Yes, ma'am.
Now, this is the definition of imagination. The imagination dissolves, diffuses, dissipates in order to recreate. So as opposed to the mimesis where we have representation, where you see the world, you try to create it, exact copy, replica of the world. Plato will say you cannot have an exact replica because no matter how beautiful you draw the tree, how beautiful you write a poem about the tree, that tree that you draw here will always be twice removed from the ideal world. Coleridge says, but we don't need. The moment you are creating that tree through your words or through your colors or through architecture, you are recreating it. You are dissolving, diffusing, and dissipating everything that you understand about that tree, about that sky, about that sunset. through your own unifying experience of imagination. And you do it through two ways. First, two steps actually, not two ways. The first is the vital, that is the fixed and the dead, fancy. These are the fixities and definites. The fancy is nothing other than memory that is not located in a specific time and space. So all cats in your mind look same. There's an image of a cat, image of a tree, image of a sky, image of a sunset. Based on that, you are recognizing the discerning faculty of your mind. You are recognizing those sensory experiences as specific perceptions, empirical phenomena. And from there, we move into the law of association, where you are creating new. And that is the reason why fancy is mechanical as opposed to imagination. Is your doubt clear about this idea of mechanical?
Yes, ma'am.
So this is what the diagram would look like. So Coleridge will say that, we have two faculties, fancy, imagination. Fancy is what is the mechanical, the memory, based on your habits of association, based on your a priori experiences of encountering the world, your previous sensory perception, your previous experiences. You create an associated memory. It's almost like a box where you have cat, dog, tree, all these ideas put together. They are all definites and fixed identities. From there, you move to the next step, imagination, where you are looking into that experience, that unit of fancy, in order to arrive at a newer definition. That definition, you do it through your own understanding, through your own sense of consciousness. The example that I gave you, you and I go to the sea, sunset, you and I begin to describe the sunset, your sentence and my sentence will be different because what it says, your faculty of imagination by which you are making sense of that sensory experience of encountering the sunset is different from my faculty of imagination. This faculty of imagination by which you and I are making sense of that sensory experience is primary imagination. After primary imagination, you have secondary imagination. Secondary imagination is difference only in terms of degree. That not only am I making sense of the sunset, but also it reminds me, say, of Tithonus, or it reminds me of the Greek god, or say Manfred, who is standing there in between of the mountains, and he is relentlessly pursuing sleep. He is an immortal. All of us want to be immortal. He is an immortal, but all that that he wants is he wants sleep. Now, this bringing in two different ideas together to create something that did not exist prior is what is secondary imagination. Did you understand?
Yes, ma'am.
Okay. Now, fancy and imagination. The mind, that is through the faculty of fancy, will gather details. It will create new by the faculty of imagination. Imagination will bring disparate images together. Fancy then A is the passive, imagination is the active power because it is creating things that did not exist. Fancy is memory. It helps a mind to take a pause, to understand, to make sense, to move in sequence through a series of images, definite images. Otherwise, the tree and the grass and the green t-shirt would look same, right? But you are making those distinctions through the discerning power of fancy. And you are using memory and choice. Imagination rearranges these fixities, For example, you can write an entire poem, an entire essay on one green leaf. And you have that O. Henry story, The Last Leaf. So you can write an entire story just on one leaf or one night or just one shoe. So that is the active power of imagination, where you're rearranging those little details which are fixed, cannot be moved, with the passive power of fancy. Did you understand the distinction? This is important to make the distinction.
Yes, ma'am.
Now, primary and secondary imagination, as you rightly pointed out, primary imagination, they are different in degrees. Now, primary imagination is something that is common to everyone. Otherwise, you and I would not have been able to make sense of the world. We can make sense of the world because we have those faculty of imagination. We can make sense of what you are seeing, how you are seeing. You are making those connections, you are making those impulses, you're moving from one to the other through the faculty of primary imagination. But that does not make, maybe it makes you can be a poet, but I cannot be a poet because I don't have recourse to the faculty of secondary imagination. Secondary imagination is a heightened degree of consciousness. It is something that unifies absolutely opposites together. It dissolves differences. It unifies images that you did not imagine would be together. So you would have maybe Kubla Khan, a structure of a dome, talking about the experience of the creation of art. Now, you did not imagine, you did not expect that a dome as a structure, architectural structure, would be used to talk about, say, the process of artistic creation. But Kubla Khan, in the poem Kubla Khan, exactly that happens, and that is able to happen because of the faculty of secondary imagination. You're putting disparates together. Now, this difference between and similarities between Coleridge and Wordsworth is important. Wordsworth holds on to the idea that meter is ornamentation. It is superficial and it is not required. Coleridge says that it is true that prose and meter may not be same, but meter, if it is there, does not change the fact that you can derive pleasure out of it. For Wordsworth will say that imagination is a mode of association. It is a way by which you're associating ideas together. Coleridge adds to that argument. Coleridge says that imagination is a cognitive function of the mind. It is the ways by which you perceive, create, transform our reality. Imagination associates, converges for Wordsworth. Imagination for Coleridge is almost like a butterfly, metamorphosis. It changes what you had earlier known. So, after you have read, say, for example, a book or a Gothic novel, Coleridge will say, now, next time when you go to a cathedral, your mind would always have, you cannot take away that experience of seeing a cathedral and the large spaces of the ceiling away from you. Because imagination forever and ever will change, metamorphosize your mind. Is the difference between Wordsworth and Coleridge clear?
Yes, but there was another one, the suspension of disbelief.
The suspension of disbelief is always there, where he's talking about, that it is, and that is where he's saying that, it is not the real that you are seeing. This is something that we discussed when we were talking about mimesis, that it is not really that you are seeing, you have to assume that that moment is what is the truth for that moment. Because all romanticism is always about moments, no? Specific moments. So that moment is where you're suspending your sense of doubt, the suspension of disbelief. You're not questioning whether that is real or not. In fact, all of romanticism, be it visual art and poetry, they say that they are always of imagination. They are always a fragment of imagination. They are not realist art. It is only with Victorian we move to realism slowly. Now, this idea of moment this idea of fragment consolidating a whole, this idea of imagination and fancy, where man is placed in the center of turbulent nature. Now, I would like to explain this through this painting. So I want us to look into this painting a little, where you have this Jerry calls the Raft of Medusa 1818. So this is right in the heart of Romanticism when this painting comes about. So if you see this painting, this is where uh, there is a ship that is now being overburdened, and therefore people are dying. The ships, the slaves were being thrown overboard because the captain was inexperienced. And after 2 weeks on being on the sea, these slaves were being cannibal. They were eating human flesh. They were dying, and only when a British ship comes in that they are rescued. And that is the moment that Theodore Géricault is painting here. Géricault is painting here, where they have just sighted that ship who might rescue them. It is that specific moment where we have. Now, if you notice here, the raft of Medusa, see that here man is not here a subject where man is overpowering. In fact, man here is an object of misery. They are slaves who are about drowning. They are eating each other. You have here figures who are eating each other, attacking each other. The seas are turbulent, absolutely horrifying experience. And there are few right in the right hand side corner who have noticed that there's a ship out there who might come and rescue us. Now, the painter could have drawn the moment when Medusa, the ship, struck the reef, or the moment when the captain throws these slaves into the sea. That would be horrifying, but that is not what he's doing. He's doing here almost a specific moment when the passengers, these slaves, see another ship in a far distance. Now, if you notice, he's also using a technique called foreshortening. Just notice here. Foreshortening meaning that, in which the painting appears to spill over onto the borders of his frame. The foreshortening draws the viewer right into the action. The bodies are spilling over, almost going to about to touch us. Straight into the action, your eyes are straining there. You want to know what is happening, what is happening. It is as if the people on board of the raft are trying to escape from the painting itself. We can see this, right? See there is this naked slave there who is coming out of the frame of the painting on the right. Now, Géricault is also constructing this painting by employing two pyramidical elements. So the painting here is actually in terms of two pyramids. The mast, which makes the top of the pyramid, that is a mast, and divides the passengers into two groups. Those in despair, the red one on the left, and those who are holding on to hope. Did you notice those people on the right hand side who
Yes,
are
they're waving at the ship.
yes, they are holding on to the hope that please, if those ship can somehow notice us and they can come. So these are two pyramids of two different kinds of human responding to misery that we have. Now, on the left, did you see this? On the left, we have an old man who is mourning the death of a sailor. That dead body is lying on the lap. The old man is Ugolina. This is a figure a character that is drawn from Dante's Divine Comedy. He is guilty of cannibalism. So he is mourning the death of the sailor, but at the same time, he is also a cannibal. He's not a cannibal, but there was nothing else that he could feed on to. So, and he was placed, and cannibalism is the worst of all sins. So, Dante has placed him in the most horrific of all hells. The mast itself, the mast that we noticed, symbolizes the Christian cross. Those who are on the left are people who got involved in sin. The red pyramid are the people who were engaging in cannibalism. If you notice here, they are holding on to dead bodies. They are eating onto the flesh of the dead bodies because they have given themselves up to despair. On the right hand side are those who still are holding on to hope, and they have a faith that there is a possibility that they might be rescued. Now, here on the right hand side of the painting, we see a red haired man. Can you see that?
Yes, ma'am.
He
He
is
looks
his
white.
red hair.
Yeah, white man.
So his hands are stretched towards the horizon in an attempt to see the English ship. And can you see his leg? So someone is chewing on his leg.
Rear
So
side of his leg.
this,
Yeah, this one. A black man chewing up his rear
yes,
side of leg.
someone has just is biting on his flesh. But this man, even in this moment when he's being eaten alive by another man, he wants to hold on to hope of being saved. We can see a man also on the barrel who is signaling. There's another man
Yes, waving at
to
the ship.
the yes, to the British vessel, and this is the man right behind them who are, we see their reactions. These are men who have completely lost hope of being saved, and therefore all they are interested in is, eating flesh of another man. Now, if you see the painting carefully, this is where the red-haired man is there. He's pointing towards a ship. The others are eating him. There's another man who's pointing, but at the same time, we don't know whether he'll be saved or not. That is a moment, that is a crucial moment where the painting is taking his viewer, but we don't know what holds forth. Now, this is the painting, the full painting we go back to. Now, if you notice the painting, this entire painting is a fight between life, death, life, being alive, attempts to be alive, and death, where you are the most horrific of all death, where you are being eaten by another man while you are alive, and hope and despair, sin and faith. This is where the weak try to drag the strong, and when the strong refuse to support the weak, the strong are not those who are supporting. We see a black haired man trying to shrug off the hands of a dead who tried to pull him towards the left. There's a black, this one, right in the center. So the doomed side towards, so that is exactly where the two sides are different, the right and the left. From the right, this man is trying to go towards the right, toward the side of the hope, and there is another man who's dragging him towards the left. Now, this is a man who said, run like a madman when he saw this painting. In fact, this is the painter De la Cruz, who's Eugene De la Cruz, whose painting we just did some time ago, The Lion Hunter, you remember?
Yes, ma'am.
Okay. Now, this is a very quintessential romantic moment where you have suffering, you have anguish. These are not
Ma'am,
human
what is the name of the
people.
old man you told about?
Ugolina, Ugolina.
Hugo. Okay.
Ugolina.
Okay.
Ugolina is a character from Dante's Divine Comedy. Uh, this is a very quintessential moment that appears in romantic art, romantic visual art, but at the same time also in, say, Shelley's Prometheus Unbound or, say, Keats's work. You have figures who are suffering, you have anguish, And there is a juxtaposition of hope and despair. Think about also Frankenstein, the monster. Throughout the book, he is suffering, no? Throughout the book, he is innocent. There's no reason for him to suffer, but he is completely left to be destitute by his own creator. As opposed to this, you have the turbulent seas, the relentless, fierce winds who are absolutely indifferent to the fate of man. So we always tend to see that nature and a man, they are always together in romantic art or romanticism or romantic age. But if you look carefully, the emphasis in romanticism, be it a romantic novel, be it a romantic poem, romantic art, the emphasis is on those moments where nature is indifferent to the languish of man. Are you following this argument?
Yes,
Now,
ma'am.
tell me, this is what actually Delacroix is writing in 1817. This is, he says it, the first time Jerichold allowed me to see his Raft of Medusa while he was still working on it. It made so tremendous an impression on me that when I came out of the studio, I started running like a madman and did not stop till I reached my own room. So you have to also place it in a way that this was an art that people did not just go there in a museum saw while sipping coffee. This was an art that was affecting. We are returning back to the idea of revolutionary energy. This was art, this was an aesthetic experience that is reminding man, the insignificant, fragile man, of how he is in this world that is uncaring. Nature, emblematic of that uncare. And this argument also comes from Hobbesian notion that the condition of man is always a condition of war, where everyone is against of everyone. It is not a happy world that we live in. So although you can say that that revolution was there, that man believed in the potential of man, but it was also the failure of revolution that had affected the romantics. It was also the ways by which war had created dead bodies unprecedented that had created this sense of deep anguish for man. Are you following? Okay.
Yes.
Could you please tell me what do you see?
It's a painting of William Turner.
Painting of?
William Turner, Joseph William Turner. Slave ship.
I know that. I said that what do you see in
Yeah,
the painting?
right. It's a ship is sinking. People are. Everything is sinking.
So
Looks
it is
like
a beautiful
turbulent,
painting of
turbulent sea, and its ship is sinking. That's all I see.
see properly. I want you to see properly. Is it a beautiful painting of a sunset?
Or sunrise, maybe.
Yes. Is it that?
Clear. Maybe it looks like. Is it sinking or in a turbulent sea?
Turbulency in sunset and sunrise?
Yeah, that's very unlikely.
Okay. Okay. What do you see
I
on the
don't
right
know.
hand
I
side?
don't know. um, Horses. Yeah, I don't know. The picture is not very clear.
Okay. So what you see is a slave ship. The title of the slave ship, in fact, is Slaves Thrown Overboard, the Dead and the Dying, Typhoon Coming On. Now, that is the title of a slave ship, the full title of a slave ship. The first impression that you have seeing is that the painting is beautiful. It has beautiful orange and red. It either is a sunset or a sunrise. There is a sea, perhaps it's a storm, but it is beautiful to look at, right? So you have a
Yes.
thick sensuality, you have the foam of the waves, all that are nice things to see, no? Now allow me to introduce you to what you see on the right hand side. What you see on the right hand side is a moment of horror. If you look closely, you will see a leg that is being eaten by fishes. What you see is a
Yes.
moment of horror when bodies were being thrown. You have parts of bodies, you don't have full body. You have parts of being bodies which are being eaten by fishes. Did
Yes.
you
Yes.
notice this?
Yes.
Now, if I tell you, look back at the painting. The painting is then, if you look closely, it is not about sunset. It is not about light on water. It is about horrific carnage. It is about a storm when a captain throws his slaves over to the sea, and the reason was for insurance. So if slaves die while on board because of illness, then you are supposed to pay insurance. Or so the only way by which he could earn a little extra was by throwing the old and the weak and the ailing slaves into the water. Now, what William Turner is showing us is a wall of water and grey clouds dooming the ship to wreck as punishment and vengeance for the death of slaves, upsetting of the balance of nature. Parts of human bodies are here and there thrown, but you won't be able to see the parts unless you look carefully. So the parts of human bodies are here and there thrown. And usually we see fishes as beautiful creatures of the ocean. But here we are seeing fishes who are eating with their teeth. We actually have images of the fish teeth there, if you see carefully. So that is juxtaposed to this beautiful sunset. Are you understanding the juxtaposition, the opposites that are placed together?
Yes. Yes. Yes.
And what we have is an utter indifference of nature. There is a fierce storm that is there, and body parts are floating, body parts that still have chains on their feet while the fishes are eating them. It is an abstract, there is a sense of abstract in the form, in the brush strokes. There's a use of intense colors, and the colors are such that you cannot make sense of it unless you see very carefully. You cannot understand the emotion of the painting, the moment of the painting, unless you see the painting carefully. Which means that is art then to express, is romanticism inviting to interpret, or is romanticism representing what is there out there so that the audience can go, the viewer or the reader can go and make sense and see?
The later half, maybe. Whatever there
How
is.
do you
It maybe both of them really, to be honest, because
so think a little carefully because remember what Coleridge told us? That art has a cognitive function. Art has art, any kind of aesthetic experience in Romantic age. Coleridge tells us that art has a role to perform. That role is to shock, to astonish, to create a feeling of sublimity, and at the same time, to force the audience to think. We are talking about thinking selves. We are not talking about, we are talking about where these individuals are always about thoughts and feelings. We are talking about individuals, poets who are thinking. And they're also inviting their viewer and reader to think. Romanticism then defines, the Romantic age defines art as interpretive and not representative. This is true for Coleridge, Wordsworth, Shelley, Keats, Mary Shelley, Frankenstein, and at the same time, visual art. Is this idea clear? This is
yes.
important. So it is
Interpretation of the poet or the artist rather than the representation of the nature, actual representation of the nature.
there's no actual, we will not use the word actual, we will use the word real.
Real, right?
Yes, and not interpretation of the artist, of art, aesthetic experience.
Okay, okay, okay.
So one of the reasons as to why nature is so relentless. Why do you think nature is so relentless? Nature should be beautiful, no? That is what our first impression is. You think about this Turner's painting, and the first thing that you told me is either it is of sunset or of sunrise. Or you think about Wordsworth, Coleridge, Keats, Shelley, they are all talking about beautiful lakes and mountains. But if you think carefully, and that is what we have been doing for these hours, why is nature so relentless and horrifying and terrifying? Any idea? Guesswork? Okay.
No.
Is nature different from what it used to be before? Because
Yeah,
of
ha, yeah. Getting it. The Industrial Revolution.
good, very good. It is because the industrial revolution changes nature forever and ever, and you cannot go back to what it was before industrial revolution. You cannot go back. It's just not possible. Industrial revolution meant that now you have a widespread unemployment, migration into the city, you have slowly urbanization, you have these new cities called London, Manchester, New York, Paris that are coming up. But all these cities are not beautiful places. They are places where you have many, many
Ma'am, your
factories.
voice is breaking.
Can you hear
Hello?
me now?
Right. Ma'am,
So
could it be that the romantic poets use nature as a escape from this industrial revolution and the ideas and the wars and the atrocities among the sea?
but they don't escape, no? They are presenting nature as horrifying and terrifying. If they would have presented nature as beautiful and comforting, then that would be an escape.
Okay.
They are not presenting comfort and solace in nature. They are presenting that, now that we have political, technological, and scientific advancements, now that we have coal and fuel and industrial revolution, urban culture, nature is in fact absolutely unclean, diseased, you have epidemics coming up, you have babies and child mortality that is very high. The rural landscape then is a lost Eden, EDE Eden for the romantics. And it becomes a moral work for them to make nature embody that failure of the revolution. Nature becomes almost nature pays a price for that failure of those revolution. Are you following?
Yes,
So
yes, yes.
all these paintings that we see, nature is seems to be turbulent. Nature is overpowering, scary, horrifying. Because nature cannot go back to that idyllic, Edenic, pastoral beauty. No, therefore, we now have sublime instead of beauty. This is what I want you to look at. This is the kind of nature that I'm talking to you about. Now, this is Delacroix is exactly Delacroix is the person who says that I see the previous painting, Jerry Cult, and he says that I ran like an
The hunting painting,
huh?
the hunt lion painting.
This is also the person Delacroix who ran like a madman after
Yeah.
seeing the previous
The
painting.
raft
Now,
on the raft painting.
yes. So he is drawing this in 1846, Abduction of Rebecca. Now, if you see this scene where this girl is being abducted, what you see is the larger part of the painting, the larger part of the frame is nature that seems to be stormy. The skies are gray and blue. Now, this is actually based on a novel of Sir Walter Scott, and it is a scene from a novel called Ivanhoe. The Jewish heroine Rebecca is confined in the castle of Front de Boeuf and is carried off by two enslaved Muslim warriors, and they are commanded by the covetous Christian knight Boaz Gilbert. The contorted interlocking poses and compacted space has only one figure that you tend to see a little carefully. Can you tell me which is the only figure that you can see a little better in the forefront as opposed to all the other figures?
Figure of Rebecca, or
Good. The figure of Rebecca. Now, what kind of figure, if you are abducted, would you be like this?
no,
It's
no.
unlikely that you would be calmly lying there. Pay attention to the face of Rebecca. There's a dormant face. Now, this painting takes us to how the Romantic age imagined characters to be. These are characters who are introspective, melancholic characters. Any romantic novel, Frankenstein, any romantic poem, prelude, Kubla Khan, Tintanabe, Keats's poem, Shelley's, any, Blake's also. They will always have introspective, melancholic characters. The atmosphere would be gloomy and dark, usually medieval settings. They will describe a revolutionary moment, and that moment would induce shock and terror. And these are also figures who would be dormant. Now, then what we have is juxtaposition. This idea of juxtaposition, in fact, has an enormous afterlife, what gets called as Gothic. So you have Wuthering Heights, you have Jane Eyre, you have uh, Dracula, you have
Dracula was
all.
it released so later in later Victorian,
Yes, 1897. But
1897.
Dracula also comes directly after The Vampire, the book that is written by John Polidori. John Polidori writes on the same night where Mary Shelley also writes Frankenstein. They
In Jenny
have this,
Lord Byron's house, Lake
yes,
House.
they have this little short story writing competition. So that is the same trajectory. Now, Gothic, and this is something that I was telling, that all these ideas also come from architecture, heavily influenced by architecture. Now, this afterlife of just juxtaposition of nature and turbulent sea and dormant figures and faces that are calm, but at the same time, man as an object of frailty and fragile figures. A lot of it comes from the medieval culture of understanding the sensational, morbid death and decay. But at the same time, these are also ideas that were simultaneously happening along with the Romantic age, and therefore you cannot have one versus the other. They were happening together simultaneously. Both were in their own ways responding to the precepts of French Revolution, Industrial Revolution, and the ways by which the rural landscape is now an urban landscape. Both are ways by which we now tend to understand how the 1790s is called romanticism. Now, what I'm trying to explain you is then what is romanticism? You need to recognize in terms of theme, technique, style, not as who is a romantic and why is he a romantic. What is the theme that makes it a romantic? What is the technique of writing, technique of visual art, technique of music that makes it romantic art, and the style. The way I remember is that all romantics, be it a painter, be it a poet, they are all non-conformist. They don't conform. They all talk about, or they write from a deep personal narrative. their writings are deeply embedded in their own private experience. They have a distinctive vision of what is constituted as aesthetic experience and art, and it is their mind, their consciousness, 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 not conscience, consciousness that is made to be the subject and object of imagination. So, what you think, what you feel becomes far more important than anything else. And that is what I keep telling that, all that our sentences in our modern world, I am, the ways in which we assume that I am important so much so that my sentences with I, capital I, begins with me. That is completely something that we have learned from the Romantics. Are you following this?
Yes, you told this at first,
Yes.
obviously.
But did you recognize how that idea comes in?
Yes.
Now, this is towards the end, this is Shelley who is now very proudly writing this defense of poetry. So by the time we reach 1840s, Shelley has to make a case. That is the reason it's called defense as to why we need poetry. You have scientific temperament already in place. He's
Shelley died
writing
in
this.
22, right?
Huh? Yes.
Shelley died in 1822, right?
This is some a lot of Shelley's work actually is published after his death by
Oh,
his wife Mary
posthumous.
Shelley.
Oh,
So he's actually writing this. He writes this in 1821, just before his death, and this is published in 1840. So uh, he is writing this defense against Love Thomas Peacock's account of poetry. And he's saying that this the name of the essay is the four ages of poetry. He's saying that this is Peacock's argument that now that we have industrial revolution, now that we are living in a world of science, you have newer discoveries every day on medicine, newer discoveries on ways in which our human body and machines work. We don't need this language of feeling. We don't need poetry. Poetry is absolutely nonsense and useless in a language of science. Now, Shelley does something that is unique. Shelley does not say poetry is important. Shelley does not say that poetry is better than science. In fact, Shelley is saying that, even when you're doing science, you're doing poetry. One good example, and this is something that I use always in the class, is how do you begin your maths equation? How do you begin your maths equation?
by thinking, by creative process.
No, you begin by any maths equation, let A equals to X. You
Yes.
start any maths equation by a process of assumption. In fact, every equation in maths starts with an assumption. Science is deeply embedded on a tradition of believing things that don't exist today. For example, uh, say my parents' generation did not believe that or could not have imagined that a post office, a calendar, and a telephone and a laptop can work in one device. Do you know what that device is?
Mobile phone.
Yes, a smartphone.
Yeah, smartphone, right.
So our generation, I know many people who don't use laptop for emails anymore. So you are using disparate inventions. You are able to invent because you believe in the faculty of imagination. You are able to create because you believe that things that don't exist today, it is possible to create. So Shelley is actually saying that, every language is metaphorical and therefore poetic. Language inherently is not tangible. So, for example, you are saying, I saw a cat. There is no tangible, concrete reason you can pinpoint as to why you're calling that animal as a cat. It is absolutely arbitrary ways by which you and I have agreed. Every language is metaphorical. Are you following?
Yes, ma'am.
If language is metaphorical, then every thought process that you express through language is arbitrary and metaphorical. In that case, whether you are a practitioner of mathematics, medicine, chemistry, science, literature, or philosophy, you are using the faculty of imagination to create ideas that do not have a concrete existence on its own. Are you following this?
Yes, ma'am. Sure.
Shelley then says that, if man has to work with two faculties, one of the faculty, if it is reason, and the other faculty is imagination. It is reason that is passive. It is reason that is dependent. Because imagination is what allows us to create. It is only with the faculty of imagination that you can work as a chemist, as a mathematician, as a literary artist. It is a source of every form of creation. Logic is only what takes us into a linearity, a sequential form of understanding, and that is a passive, a lesser form of mental faculty called rationality and reason. Shelley very cleverly then maneuvers his argument as imagination to be the most important faculty of human reason. Are you following?
Yes, yes.
Now, this is what I was trying to explain you. Shelley tells that our mind has two parts, reason and imagination. Reason is what is passive, imagination is what is the important part. Reason is what enables us to create the move into linear narratives. Imagination is what creates and expresses the truth and the beautiful, and every form of our understanding eventually is about this. And he gives this example of how every way in which our society functions, be it grammar, be it science, everything is about imagination, because imagination is the only way by which you will not move mechanically from point A to point B, but you will move through your thought processes. And without thought processes, Shelley will say, you cannot even say that I am alive, or I see the light, or I see the tree, I see the animal. Every thought processes for Shelley works through language, and language, because it is inherently metaphorical, therefore is poetic. Poets in that case are, according to Shelley, the unacknowledged legislators of the world. Did you understand this beautiful
Yes,
argument of
yes.
Shelley?
I read it before this argument.
Okay, so I'll just recap, and this is the last that we will. So, Romantic Age then is a visionary idea of art. It creates a different way by which you place a value of a poet. It gives a new definition of a selfhood that is inward, introspective, introspects, reflects. This turn towards inwards to arrive at a consciousness is something that emerges in a context of violence of the French Revolution, Industrial Revolution, urbanization, colonial power. And romantics are important not just because, we are talking about the rejection of meter and diction, individualism, but also romanticism changes forever the ways in which we define ourselves. We think our ideas of selfhood are important. Romantic age, therefore, is indispensable to the ways by which you define the I have been trying to explain you. If there are any doubts, maybe we can discuss them during our question answers round, if that is fine with you.
Yes.
Okay, okay.
When will be the Q&A session?
So that would be on the day of the
19 and 20.
yes.